Can a monster hunter slay the king of monsters? We'll be taking a look at each character's durability, attack power, and endurance stats, as well as any relevant gear and battle strategies, and see who comes out on top. Godzilla's durability comes from the sheer toughness of his scales and, of course, his size. Godzilla has two main feats that show us just how durable he is. First, he tanks a thermonuclear warhead detonation in his face. Those things reach 55 to 165 million degrees Celsius. For reference, that's roughly 10 times hotter than the core of our sun. So he has sun-level heat resistance, and that doesn't even include the concussive impact from the bomb. Speaking of concussive impacts, let's talk about feat number 2. Feat number 2 comes when in King of the Monsters, King Ghidorah brings Godzilla to the upper limits of the atmosphere and drops him into a free fall where he plummets back to Earth and slams into the ground with no protection whatsoever. That impact has roughly the same amount of concussive force as a nuclear bomb, so he's radiation resistant, heat resistant, and impact resistant, but he's not invulnerable. The one weakness that Godzilla's scales have are penetration. Look here. In Godzilla vs. Kong, King Kong manages to penetrate all the way through his scales using his axe. And this makes sense because Godzilla most closely resembles crocodilians, which have what are called osteoderms for scales. Let's use those for reference and scale them up to G-Man's size so we can see exactly how tough these are. Coming in at roughly 400 feet tall and 100,000 tons, we can use this information to figure out exactly how thick Godzilla's hide is. If we assume that the scale to body mass ratio is roughly the same for Godzilla that it is for crocodiles, then it gives us the following measurements. In thinner spots, like his joints or his abdomen, he would have roughly 2 to 3 foot thick walls of biological armor reinforced by bone and keratin composites. This gives his armor plating a tensile strength of 200 to 400 megapascals. In thicker areas like his back or his neck, those scales would reach 4 to 6 feet in thickness. With this level of durability, you could fire a modern tank round at Godzilla's scales at point-blank range, and that would be roughly the same as tossing a tennis ball at a rhinoceros. He's covered in what is essentially a concrete wall layered with Kevlar and reinforced with steel rebar, which explains why he's face-tanked everything from everyone he's ever fought. That's it for Godzilla's durability, and that's really all you need, usually. Moving on to attack power. Here is where Godzilla's loadout gets deep. Let's start with Godzilla's hands. His claws are too large to do any kind of slash-style damage against someone as small as a monster hunter, so the best he can do is swat him around like a fly, but that's way more terrifying than you might think. Given the size of Godzilla's arm, a realistic swing speed for him would be roughly 223 miles an hour. Given the mass of his arm, that would mean that he's got roughly 1/3 the power of a nuclear bomb on detonation when he swats something. If this were to hit a monster hunter, given their size and weight, it would send them flying at roughly 4,000 miles an hour, or Mach 5.3. And if they didn't hit any obstacles while they're flying, they would travel 6.9 miles before they finally slowed down to a stop. Now let's talk legs. Godzilla's anatomy isn't exactly well suited for kicking style attacks, so let's examine what a stomp from G-Man is like. With his size and weight, each one of his stomps puts out roughly 1 billion newtons of force. For reference, that's more than having an entire skyscraper collapse on top of you. And that's still not all for Godzilla's offensive capabilities. He's got tail swipes too. His tail is roughly 300 feet long, and we can estimate that his tail swings are roughly 400 miles an hour. With his tail taking up roughly 20% of his mass, that means that he'll be delivering 324 million joules of energy, or roughly 77 tons of TNT, with every swipe of his tail. This is the equivalent of having a modern freight train slam into you at 800 miles an hour, and carries more than enough demolition power to level multiple city blocks in one single swipe. I know you've been waiting for this one, so let's talk atomic breath. In a previous video, we figured out that Godzilla's atomic breath is a sustained beam of roughly 20 to 30,000 degrees Celsius. This is multiple times hotter than the surface of the sun, which is only 5,600 degrees Celsius, which means Godzilla can not only tank sun level heat, but he can dish it out as well. He's basically a walking sun with scales. Now, atomic breath is not the only threat in Godzilla's mouth. He's got teeth as well, but again, considering the size of the Monster Hunter, he wouldn't really bite down on him, he would just swallow the Monster Hunter whole. And I'm not really sure if that'd be worse for Godzilla or the Monster Hunter. Let's move on to Godzilla's endurance. Godzilla has regenerative capabilities not only for recovering from physical damage, but also from stamina depletion. However, we have seen that over the course of long fights with other kaiju, he does get beaten down and worn out to a point that outpaces his regeneration, leaving him sluggish and in need of a good recovery session or a big G-Man nap. But those fights usually take place over multiple days where he's fighting one or multiple kaiju-sized opponents, and the only break he gets is when they stop and disengage, and he literally has to pursue them across the planet. When it comes to a fight, Godzilla literally does not stop until he's won or he's dead. So his endurance does have a limit and he can be worn down, but it takes an incredibly long time, and you've got to be able to survive fighting the G-Man long enough to even get there in the first place. Monster Hunter. Let's take a look at their durability. When fighting against the jet-powered dragon Valstrax, Monster Hunters get tackled by speeds exceeding Mach 3, and not only survive, but they get right back up and get back in the fight immediately afterwards. This is the same as having a Boeing 747 crash directly into you at 759 miles per hour and just brushing it off and moving along. This gives a Monster Hunter bones that are 20,000 times more fracture resistant than titanium, and skin that is 7,000 times more puncture resistant than Kevlar. This means they could take a direct hit from the most powerful railgun on Earth, and once they get up, it would leave little more than a bruise. And that's not even close to all they have for durability feats. They tank fire blasts from monsters that get so hot it can melt pure steel into liquid in a matter of seconds. That makes the fire breath of those monsters 25,000 degrees Celsius or higher, meaning the Monster Hunter's heat resistance is on par with tungsten, the most heat-resistant alloy on Earth. Hunters also get exposed to deadly levels of radiation, necrotic gases, venom, acid, frost, and more without it ever being more than a mild inconvenience. And lastly, Monster Hunters craft armor and weapons made of the body parts of the monsters they've slain, further adding to their level of durability that was already supernatural to begin with. It's important to note that Monster Hunters also choose the set of armor that is most beneficial for the fight that they're going into. So a Monster Hunter would choose an armor set with really high heat resistance when going into a fight against Godzilla to further enhance their heat tanking abilities. Monster Hunter attack power. Monster Hunters are immensely strong, capable of winning sumo-style shoving matches with giant monsters and wielding a 3,000-pound hammer and swinging it around like it's a baseball bat. This gives them strength exceeding the ability to deadlift roughly 23,000 pounds. But that strength alone isn't worth anything in a fight against Godzilla until you apply it to their weapons. Speaking of weapons, it's important to note that while Monster Hunters do have access to 14 different weapons, as of the most recent game Monster Hunter Wilds, they only bring 2 out on any given hunt. So, without going through each one and saying why they would or wouldn't bring it, we're gonna say our hunter brings a longsword and a bow, giving him a solid up-close melee weapon, and a ranged weapon, giving him the ability to continue the fight whether he's up close or far away. Now, we also have to remember that these are not just regular longswords and bows we're talking about here. Monster Hunter's arsenal is specifically crafted to take down kaiju-style monsters with supernatural powers, which lines up pretty well with how we would describe Godzilla. These are kaiju executioner blades, and they're good at it. Now, let's talk about the attack power of these weapons real fast. A bow from a Monster Hunter game typically has a draw strength of around 3,066 pounds, and an arrow that's roughly 70 pounds of solid metal and can even have an explosive attached to it. But this just doesn't carry enough force to penetrate through Godzilla's scales. But what it can penetrate is soft, fleshy tissue like his eyes or the inside of his mouth. Now let's talk about the longsword. These are going to be very dangerous for Godzilla, with many of them having the blade portion alone being roughly 7 feet long and coming to a thin, tapered point. If you add the demigod tier strength of a Monster Hunter behind it, it will penetrate through Godzilla's scales all the way to the hilt. This would be about as easy for the Monster Hunter as you taking a sewing needle and penetrating it into your arm. Now, once a Monster Hunter plunges his sword into Godzilla's scales, slicing downwards or upwards becomes a lot easier because its integrity has already been compromised, meaning he could create a 7-foot deep and multiple foot long, wide, gaping hole that would be dangerous even for Godzilla. So while both the bow and the longsword do have the ability to cause significant damage to Godzilla, they come with a catch. The bow requires you to be face-on with Godzilla, which is the last of all places you want to be in a fight with G-Man, and the sword requires you to get up close and personal, which is not exactly a great position to be in either. So can it hurt Godzilla? Yes, but it's incredibly risky no matter how you slice it. Monster Hunter Endurance. In the games, they fight creatures multiple times their size for 50 minutes straight, without stopping to drink, eat, or rest for more than a few moments to catch their breath, and then they get right back into it with full bore maximum effort. And let's not forget, they're swinging around a 3,000 pound hammer that whole 50-minute fight as well. These guys are the epitome of endurance. Even if a Monster Hunter gets knocked out in a fight, they get right back up, brush themselves off, and get right back into the fight full bore again. You cannot keep a Monster Hunter down. Let's move on to gear. Godzilla obviously doesn't have anything besides his anatomy, which we've already discussed, but a Monster Hunter has plenty of extra tools in his arsenal. We'll be excluding healing items here to keep this fight breakdown simple. Hunters have what are called slingers, which come with what I could see being very useful: flash pods. These emit a bright flashbang, and so far as we know, Godzilla is not immune to being stunned by light, so at a very minimum, I could see these stunning the G-Man for at least 1 to 2 seconds, and when someone like the Monster Hunter is involved in a fight, that can make all the difference. The next and arguably most important thing the slinger does is it can fire a grappling hook that allows a Monster Hunter to lift themselves up and swing around with almost the same level of agility as Spider-Man. This is huge because it allows them to not only close the distance with Godzilla, but also break contact and dodge a variety of attacks. And hunters are no stranger to using this grappling hook to hop on the head, back, side, or even tail of a monster and slash away at it while the monster desperately tries to kick them off like they're a rodeo bull. So closing the distance with this grappling hook is not only easy, but it's a strategy the hunter is likely going to use. Lastly, we have battle strategy. Godzilla is realistically a brawler. He just leans on his durability and overwhelming power to overcome enemies, just bashing, slashing, throwing his tail around, and using his atomic breath when necessary, and he usually comes out on top. Why create a battle strategy when you've never needed one to win in the first place? The Monster Hunter, however, almost never has any choice but to use every tool in their arsenal to their max ability and come into every monster engagement they ever face with a battle strategy of some kind, and a fight against Godzilla will be no different. Then, while we know that Monster Hunters can tank massive hits and survive, they're not just going to do so because they think they can. He will prioritize dodging any of Godzilla's attacks, and he has the tools and the ability to do so. Considering they're also capable of dodging those Mach 3 dive bombs we talked about earlier, that means their reaction speed is more than enough to be able to dodge anything Godzilla could throw at them, so long as they see it coming. Additionally, in the most recent game, we see that monster hunters are very adept at creating open wounds and then exploiting those wounds to make each attack not only do more damage, but cause more pain and enrage the monster, making it think less and act more erratic, giving the hunter an advantage. And they do all of this on purpose. Considering that Godzilla is among the largest creatures that a monster hunter has ever faced off against, they're gonna know that the only real options here are to get in front of him and risk an atomic breath attack to get a one-hit kill in the eyes, mouth, or gills, or use his sword to create wounds, exploit them over time, and whittle Godzilla down until he has no endurance and strength left. Now, let's see how this fight goes down. Hunter, the guild authorizes you to slay Godzilla. First thing the hunter's gonna do is get out of the way of Godzilla's mouth. They regularly fight creatures that spit venom, fire, ice, wind, and more from that part of their body, and he's not gonna risk those attacks right off rip. Then there's also the fact that Godzilla could just swallow him whole. The hunter swings up and around the back of Godzilla while firing off rounds from their bow, only to realize that they just can't penetrate his hide. Being a quick learn, the hunter realizes they have no other choice than to get in there and get up close and personal with melee. Being well aware of the anatomy of large reptilian creatures and where their scales are thinnest, the hunter pinpoints an area that gives him the best chance of penetration. With the arrows essentially being little more than a fly landing on his skin, Godzilla isn't even paying mind to the hunter yet, let alone considering him a threat. But that's about to change because underestimating the hunter gives them the opening that they need. The hunter clings their grapple to Godzilla and swings onto the back of his leg, where with every ounce of strength, they plunge their long sword into the back of Godzilla's knee, all the way down to the hilt. This not only penetrates all the way through his scaly layer, but goes multiple feet into flesh. Godzilla feels this attack and it hurts, but with the hunter being in a difficult to reach spot and Godzilla's size making him relatively slow, he goes to swat the hunter, but it gives the hunter just enough time to rip the blade down, making a gaping, wide wound and grapple away before Godzilla can reach him. Godzilla, now enraged, starts violently swinging at the hunter. Arm swings, tail swipes, stomps, all to no avail. Godzilla's never fought something this small and nimble before, and he's very hard to pin down. In typical Godzilla fashion, his failure to hit the hunter fuels his rage, and he powers up his atomic breath. He's done with games. He aims at the hunter and unleashes his beam, but the hunter recognizes the charge up of powerful beasts with supernatural abilities and begins evasive maneuvers before he can let off the beam. The hunter uses his slinger to dodge and weave his way around the beam as Godzilla follows him closer than any monster ever has before. But being so narrowly focused on avoiding this death beam, the hunter doesn't realize from behind a tail swipe comes in and slaps him out of the air. The hunter is sent flying through the air at incredible speeds and slams into a building. Luckily, their superhuman anatomy allows them to survive, and they try to get up and brush themselves off to get back to it. But they notice through the gaping hole they left in the side of the building, Godzilla is staring them down and already charging up a follow-up breath attack. With no time to spare, the hunter rushes towards the opening and dives down, narrowly avoiding Godzilla's breath. On his descent, the hunter fires a flashpot up towards Godzilla's face. With the bright bang in his eyes, it stops his breath and leaves him dazed for just a moment. Seeing this opening, the hunter attaches their grapple to Godzilla once again, swings around, and starts doing what they do better than any hunter in history: chip away at Godzilla little by little. The hunter notches an explosive round in their bow, sets their eyes on the wound they made earlier, and lets the arrow fly. It flies and sinks deep into the flesh of Godzilla's open wound, and boom! What was once a thin slash becomes a huge, gaping wound on the back of Godzilla's knee. The king of monsters starts to bleed. Now more enraged than ever before, Godzilla starts flinging his body around erratically in a desperate attempt to stop the hunter from attaching to him. But enraged beasts are nothing new for a monster hunter. With it now way too risky to attach their slinger to Godzilla himself, the hunter uses the environment to go from dodging attacks to gaining a strong position to sink another explosive arrow at every opportunity that Godzilla gives. Godzilla is powerful, but he's too large and lumbering to catch a hunter that's on the move. Repeatedly hitting that open wound on Godzilla leaves larger, deeper, and more devastating levels of damage on Godzilla's leg until finally, he collapses to a knee. The damage and pain have just become too much, and Godzilla is now immobilized. Godzilla, immobilized and desperate to survive, knows that he only has one chance to hit the hunter now: his atomic breath. The hunter, having learned that this attack takes time to charge up, positions himself in front of Godzilla and notches one final explosive arrow. Now staring down the blue glow of death, the hunter looses his arrow. It flies straight into Godzilla's eye, penetrates through it and into his brain, and detonates. The glow fades from Godzilla's mouth and he falls lifeless to the ground. The hunter has slain Godzilla. But why did it go down like this? Unfortunately for the G-Man, who is well suited in going blow for blow with other kaijus and coming out on top as the alpha of monsters, he's facing a monster hunter. And they're specifically suited for outmaneuvering and chipping away at monsters the size of mountains that can blow fire that's as hot as the sun. This is what monster hunters do multiple times a day their entire life. They hunt down Godzilla-sized monsters with supernatural powers, and they're good at it. They regularly dodge attacks way faster than anything Godzilla can do, and they kill monsters even bigger than Godzilla himself by whittling them down while staying alive to do so. G-Man is certainly more challenging than a lot of the monsters they fight, but in the end, the monster hunter has a new set of armor and a weapon to go with it, and if you want to know exactly how strong a monster hunter is, or if a monster hunter could take on the Avengers, then you'll have to come back for that. Bye!